Sir Orfeo. ca. 1300. 1. Sir Orfeo. Genre: medieval romance. Referential approach. Sir Orfeo is typically referred to as a Middle English romance or medieval romance, often highlighting its lyrical structure and its roots in folk and fairy tales. Sir Orfeo is a reworking of the classical myth of the great musician Orpheus and his wife Eurydice. According to Ovid's Metamorphoses, Eurydice died of a snake bite at her wedding and went to Hades, the place of the dead. Orpheus undertook to follow her there, and having come before Pluto and Proserpina, the king and queen of Hades, he so pleased them with his music that they granted Eurydice's release, on the condition, however, that she should follow behind Orpheus as they left Hades and that he should not look back at her. But Orpheus did look back, and Eurydice disappeared into Hades. Ovid's stories were told and retold during the Middle Ages, and frequently the teller altered the plot to suit his own purposes. In her tale The Wife of Bath, lines 958 ff. Substitutes Midas' wife for his barber as the discoverer of his ass's ears. The poet of Sir Orfeo has given the story a happy ending and has replaced its alien classical elements with familiar elements of medieval folklore. Hades has become the land of faerie, the medieval otherworld, inhabited by supernatural creatures who seem human in most respects, but who exist under laws incomprehensible to ordinary human beings. There is no rational explanation of why the king of faerie should seize Dame Eurydice, except that by going to sleep under an imp tree, a grafted fruit tree, she unwittingly violated a taboo and put herself in his power. In folklore, trees are, of course, often given sinister properties. In lines 885 ff. of her tale, the wife of Bath comments that incubi once resided under trees. And in the Fairy Queen I.e. 30, the Red Cross Knight has a frightening experience with a tree he is sitting under. In the otherworld, Dame Eurydice continues to sleep under a tree, apparently a replica of the one in her own garden. That the poem was the product of a minstrel seems certain because of the emphasis laid upon the value of music. Orfeo is an excellent harper who welcomes all good harpers to his court. When he becomes a hermit, he keeps his harp near him and plays it to solace himself. The animals and birds crowd around him in delight, as they did with Orpheus, and like the original Orpheus he frees his wife by his music. When he returns to his own kingdom, it is by his harp and his harping that he is identified. Even Orfeo's steward appreciates music. In most medieval romances, stewards are pictured as wicked, for they were the court officers responsible for offering or withholding hospitality for minstrels. And apparently they often withheld it, with unusual tact. The poet depicts a good steward who, partly because of his courtesy to harpers, becomes king after Orfeo's death. The poem was probably translated from a French romance of the kind called a Breton lay. As the name implies, this genre of romance had its origin in Brittany, a place noted for its minstrelsy. Other surviving lays share with Sir Orfeo a plot involving the supernatural, wedded or romantic love, and a rash promise. They also share the poem's stylistic simplicity, brevity, and a generally optimistic spirit. Chaucer's Franklin's Tale imitates the form, and it is probable that his model was Sir Orfeo, whose opening lines the Franklin seems to be echoing in his own story. The English translation was probably made before 1300, but it has survived in only 3 manuscripts of later date. Some scholars believe that the best of these, the Auchinleck manuscript, may once have been read by Chaucer. Only the Auchinleck manuscript makes the interesting identification of Thracians, Thrace, with Winchester. Some English minstrel poet obviously adapted the poem to a performance at Winchester, which had, indeed, in Old English times been the seat of a kingdom. It was probably the same poet who fractionally learned names King Pluto and King Juno among Orfeo's ancestors. The text presented here is based on the Auchinleck manuscript, though the spelling has been normalized and readings from the other manuscripts adopted where they seem better than Auchinleck's. In view of the large amount of evident corruption in all three manuscripts, the editor has made a number of conjectural emendations. The original metrical form was probably octosyllabic couplets with alternating stress. But what has come down to us are loose four-stressed couplets. As in Chaucer, there are many headless lines where the stress falls on the first syllable of the line, even though the syllable is not a rhetorically important one. And also as in Chaucer, while final E is frequently used to achieve an unstressed syllable, it is equally often ignored. Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. 2. Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. Genre: Arthurian romance. Referential approach. Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is best referred to as an Arthurian romance or chivalric romance. It's noteworthy for its complex interweaving of themes of honor, chivalry, and the heroic quest. Yet exasperatingly reasonable. It suddenly seems to become slightly unreal, as if the Green Knight insultingly implies that its reputation were founded more on fiction than on fact, as if the poets that celebrated it had been working harder to enhance its glory than the knights themselves. In any case, the court is to receive a testing, which is naturally entrusted to the most courteous and valiant knight of the Round Table. In this most English of Arthurian romances, Gawain has not been replaced as the best of knights by the continental-born Lancelot. Once Gawain has set out to keep his promise to the Green Knight, his humiliation, and by inference that of the court, begins. In describing Gawain's adventures, the poet, for all his epic enhancement and overt praise for the hero, actually tells a tale of his increasing helplessness. First of all, Gawain's courtesy fails him, not, to be sure, in the sense that he relinquishes it, but in the sense that it involves him in a profoundly embarrassing and dangerous situation with the lady. It results in trouble instead of the serenity that courtesy, as the diplomat's virtue, is supposed to procure. Then the second of his great virtues, his martial prowess, is denied to him by the promise he has made not to defend himself against the Green Knight's return stroke. Thus betrayed by or cut off from the two qualities that he supposes to have made him the splendid knight people think him to be, he also, with very human lack of logic, momentarily cuts himself off from the power that has actually permitted those qualities to flourish in him. For when the pressures increase, Street, Mary's knight, no longer able to rely on himself, relies not on Saint Mary but on a belt of supposed magical powers, which he must accept from the lady with ignominy and hide from her lord with dishonesty. When the Green Knight spares his life, there is revealed to Gawain his own real impoverishment, the complete incapacity of the greatest of Arthur's knights to help himself. He has found that without God's grace the virtues which he has made particularly his own are of no use to him, that, indeed, he no longer possesses them. The poem ends happily. But the baldric that the courtiers wear in honor of Gawain's adventure is a reminder that what God asks of men is not primarily courtly or martial prowess, but a humble and a contrite heart. This didactic point is made with a most Chaucer-like indirection, a fine irony that strips Gawain of his pretensions but leaves him his charm and shows him sympathy for the really quite unfair nature of his predicament, and which also enjoys, and makes the reader enjoy, the embarrassment the hero is made to suffer. Sir Gawain is one of the latest and certainly the best of the Middle English romances. Yet its greatness lies in the fact that, without ever ceasing to be a romance, a fiction full of the most exquisite comic touches, it is something much larger. One of the really significant literary achievements of the Middle Ages. Pearl. ca. 1375 to 1400. 3. Pearl. Genre. Dream vision. Elegy. Referential approach. Pearl can be classified as a dream vision or allegorical elegy. It combines elements of personal loss, elegiac, with the structured vision of allegorical significance. Pearl is preserved in the same manuscript as Sir Gawain and the Green Knight and is generally believed to have been written by the same poet. Like Piers Plowman, it is a dream vision concerning love and, again like Piers Plowman, it purports to be written by a dreamer who needs to learn in his heart Christian truths that he already knows in his head. In Pearl, the narrator's grief for the loss of a jewel is so extravagant as to suggest that the pearl he speaks of must stand for something more irreplaceable than a mere ornament. Yet, it is only gradually that we come to realize that the pearl-bedecked maiden he meets in his dream is the thing he has lost, and that on earth she was his infant daughter. The adult form in which he sees her is, of course, spiritual. It is her mission to explain to him that his grief for her death is not only extravagant but according to Christian principles wrong. For she has become a bride of the Lamb of God in a heaven whose physical characteristics are those of the New Jerusalem described by St. John in the Book of Revelation. She resolves the dreamer's doubts about infant salvation, whether those who die in infancy can attain heaven, which apparently increased his grief for her death. But it is not without a struggle, and some impatience, that she manages to do this. For the dreamer remains stubbornly earth-bound. He cannot easily accept the fact that his daughter has become so exalted in heaven, and fears that she has misbehaved, pushing herself forward too aggressively. He has trouble comprehending the paradox that in heaven varying degrees of honor and total equality exist simultaneously. And one feels that even after his dream he will find it hard to accept in his heart Pearl's doctrine that the pearl he ought to seek is not herself, but the one the merchant in Matthew gave all his wealth for, the kingdom of heaven. The vision he is granted at the end of the poem is broken off when he tries to cross the stream that separates him from the heavenly city because he is eager to rejoin his pearl, whom he sees among the 144,000 virgins, as described by St. John, before the throne of the Lamb. He awakens from his dream a chastened and perhaps more patient man, who, like Langland's will, has been taught that he must apprehend more profoundly what he already knew. Technically the poem imitates a perfectly rounded gem. It consists of 20 sections, all but one of which contain 5 12-line stanzas with the inordinately difficult rhyme scheme Abababa BBCBC. Not unexampled in Middle English poetry but never elsewhere attempted in so long a poem. Within the sections, the last word of each stanza is the same, in form if not in meaning, and is repeated in the first line of the following stanza. And this word also appears in the first line of the succeeding section. The chain thus formed is made whole by the fact that the last lines of the poem echo with expanded meaning. The first perfection of form is broken only by section 15, which contains 6 instead of 5 stanzas, so that the poem is not of the round number of 200 lines, but of 212. Perhaps the poet intentionally broke the pattern because he felt that any jewel of man's making must be imperfect. Or perhaps he was responding to the fact that the multiple 12x12 equals 144, and that 144 is a reflection of the 144. virgins in the Book of Revelation that provides much of the imaginative stimulus for the poem. Piers Plowman. ca. 1372–1389. 4. Piers Plowman. Genre: allegorical narrative. Dream vision. Referential approach. Piers Plowman is an allegorical narrative, or visionary allegory. It is also appropriate to discuss it as part of the tradition of medieval dream vision literature, emphasizing its social and theological critiques. The large number of manuscripts in which the vision of Piers Plowman has been preserved indicates its wide popularity from the end of the 14th century up to the reign of Elizabeth I. Yet celebrated as the poem was, we know little about its origin. It exists in 3 versions, which scholars refer to as the A, B, and C texts. The first, about 400 lines long, stops at a rather inconclusive point in the action. The second, generally agreed to be the best form of the poem, is a revision of the first plus an extension of more than 400 lines. And the third is a revision of the second. The name frequently associated with the poem is William Langland. But who he was and whether he wrote all 3 versions is not known. The little that can be inferred about him suggests that he came from the west of England and was probably a native of the Malvern Hills area in which the poem is set and where many of the surviving manuscripts were copied. If he wrote all 3 versions, then his interests and opinions must have changed while he was at work. For the versions differ from one another in many respects. But if more than one poet was involved, then it is extraordinary that all 3 versions share the same highly individual style and reflect the same curious and interesting poetic personality. Whatever its origin, the poem was avidly read and studied by a great many people. Within 4 years of the writing of the second version, which scholars have good evidence to date 1377, the year of Edward III's death and Richard II's accession to the throne, it had become so well known that the leaders of the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 used phrases borrowed from it as part of the rhetoric of the rebellion. The poem must therefore have managed to catch the imagination of a number of readers. Piers Plowman has the form of a dream vision, a common medieval type in which the author presents his story under the guise of having dreamed it. Most dream visions concern romantic love. Piers Plowman also concerns love. But in this instance, the love is theological. The dream vision generally involves allegory, not only because one expects from a dream the unrealistic, the fanciful, but also because people have always suspected that dreams relate the truth in a disguised form, that they are natural allegories. Piers Plowman is perhaps the greatest of English allegories, though the reader who expects to find in it the kind of definite and clear statement that allegory makes in the morality every man will be disappointed. Allegory here is used not so much in order to define the known, as the character, good deeds, does in that play, as to explore the unknown, in particular the great spiritual mysteries of Christianity. When handling these the poet's imagination, for convenience let us assume a single poet. Langland is apt to soar into a mode of expression that stimulates and excites readers' imaginations while perhaps bewildering their intellects. Langland's theme is nothing less than the history of Christianity as it unfolds both in the world of the Old and New Testaments and in the life and heart of an individual 14th-century Christian, 2 seemingly distinct realms between which the poet's allegory moves with dizzying rapidity. Expanding the genre of dream vision, Piers Plowman takes the form of a whole series of visions, separated by brief intervals when the narrator is awake. The first passage chosen for translation, the prologue to the poem, introduces the famous first vision of the field of folk. The poet thought of Christianity as properly informing and reforming society. and he describes 14th-century English society in terms of its failure to represent an ideal society living in accord with Christian principles. Hence the satirical poetry for which Langland is generally noted. Society's failure, of course, is attributable in part to the corruption of the Church and churchmen. And whenever he considers clerical and ecclesiastical corruption, he pours out savagely indignant satire. But he is equally angry with the failure of the wealthy laity, untaught by the Church to practice charity, to alleviate the sufferings of the poor. And it was probably his preoccupation with the poor that made his poem popular with the rebels of 1381. These, though confused in their motives, were eager to obtain correction of certain social abuses that Langland touches upon. This use of his poem must have horrified him. For despite his interest in social reform, he remains a fundamentally conservative and orthodox thinker. Yet his passionate sympathy for the common man, idealized in his titular hero Piers the Ploughman, made him seem a radical who felt that true religion was best represented not by the Church but by the humblest orders of society. Many persons reading his poem more than a century and a half after it was written, it was first printed in 1550, saw in its prologue strong historical reasons for the reformation of the Church that had been carried out in the intervening years. After his vision of the field of folk in the prologue, Will the dreamer is in passus I. Passus is Latin for step. And the word the poet uses for the sections of his poem, approached by Lady Holy Church, who explains to him the fundamental principles of Christianity, with which, presumably, he has been familiar since childhood. But mere knowledge is not enough for him. He must learn by experience and feel in his heart what he learns. Now that he has seen truth in the person of Lady Holy Church, he asks to be shown the false. And Holy Church leaves him to witness the marriage of a suddenly personified false to Lady Mead. Mead, portrayed as an alluring wealthy woman, is an ambiguous allegorical figure. Her many rascally followers recognize her as bribery. But theology considers her the reward God has promised to give to true men, and objects to her proposed marriage to false. As a result of this objection, Mead and false, accompanied by a vast train of dishonest members of society, proceed to London to get legal opinion on the validity of their marriage. The king is warned of their coming and sends officers to arrest Mead. All the remainder of the company runs away. Though under arrest, Mead is warmly welcomed in the royal court, whose functionaries she at once starts to corrupt with money and promises of influence. The king proposes that she marry one of his knights named Conscience, to which she gladly assents. But when Conscience appears, he refuses to marry her, and she and he have a long debate about the true meaning of her name Mead. She tries to describe herself as merely payment for services rendered or things purchased. But Conscience will allow her no licit role in society. He declines to obey the king's command to become reconciled with her, unless reason advises him to do so. Reason is summoned and, aided by Mead's flagrant attempts to corrupt the king's justice, succeeds in persuading the king and his subjects that Mead must be condemned. Here the dreamer awakes for the first time. But after a very short interval, he falls asleep again and dreams that reason preaches a sermon to the entire kingdom. At the end of this, the people confess their sins, an action which Langland describes by personifying the 7 deadly sins. Each one then relates, to a personified figure, repentance, how he behaves in society. These confessions, constituting much of passus V of the B text of the poem, display most clearly Langland's social realism.